First though, here in the UK, Sir Keir Starmer's position on single-sex spaces, women and trans people dominated Prime Minister's questions today, with Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch accusing him of lacking moral courage. Last week, as you know, the UK Supreme Court ruled that the legal definition of a woman should be based on biological sex under the 2010 Equality Act. Judges also emphasised the Act protects trans people from discrimination and harassment. Here's how Sir Keir Starmer's position has changed since he became Labour leader.
Hello to everyone celebrating the Pride for All festival. I'm proud to be leader of the Labour Party, a party which has a long history of standing with the LGBT+ community, and we're committed to updating the GRA to introduce self-declaration for trans people.
Is it transphobic to say only women have a cervix?
Well, it is something that shouldn't be said. It is not right, but Andrew, I don't think that...
So Rosie Duffied should not have said that. Can you explain to people watching why she should not have said that?
So a woman can have a penis?
Look, I'm not... I don't think we can conduct this debate with, you know...
Sorry,
I
have I offended you in some?
No, it's just... look, on the biology, I agree with what Tony Blair said the other day in relation to men having penises and women having vaginas. But what I will say is...
So you changed your position?
Just on the biology, that doesn't help on the gender. A woman is an adult female, and the court has made that absolutely clear.
Let's talk now to Rosie Duffied, the independent MP for Canterbury, formerly a Labour MP until she resigned, in part because of how she says she was treated after speaking up for the importance of single-sex spaces. Good evening to you. Welcome to the Insight. I'd like to talk to you about the Prime Minister's position, how you feel you've been treated, the fears amongst the trans community, and also some of the practical issues arising from the ruling, if that's okay.
Yeah.
First of all, what do you think of the Prime Minister's change in position?
I think it's just another issue where we haven't really seen leadership or kind of, being ahead of the issues. We've just seen reactions. And when you change your views on so many things, from kind of poverty and child poverty and winter fuel allowance right through to the trans arguments, it's just hard to see that person as having any views at all, which is something I set out in my resignation letter. We don't really know where Keir Starmer stands on things.
Well, we do now, because he says he welcomes the Supreme Court ruling.
Yeah.
Does it matter that he, or the Foreign Secretary, or the Education Secretary once believed one thing, but now believe the Supreme Court ruling?
I think it does matter. I think it's important to be able to change your mind and to take advice from groups that are stakeholders. That's really important, to listen to the arguments. But at the same time, we get accused of all being the same and all being liars and changing our tune. So you have to have some core beliefs. For all of our criticisms about Jeremy Corbyn, and I famously had my clashes with him, he was always a conviction politician. For kind of 30, 40 years, he's had the same core beliefs. And I think if you don't know where the party's going and where the leadership of the party is going, that's actually quite important for voters to know.
Right. But you've said you accept it's okay for politicians to change their mind.
Yeah, to a degree.
What we have seen here. Do you think the Prime Minister has been on the wrong side of history?
I think he hasn't really understood this issue or drilled down on it, or, he probably thought it was a fringe issue. I think a lot of the people that are now in the Cabinet thought it was a culture war and a fringe thing. It wasn't very important. So they didn't listen when we were going, this is really going to be big. They didn't listen at the time.
I'd like to play to you this clip from PMQs today, in which you feature. Have a look.
Mr. Speaker, I've always approached this on the basis that we should treat everyone with dignity and respect, whatever their different views, and I'll continue to do so.
What were you thinking in that moment?
I was a bit peed off, to be honest. I've heard it all before, and politician-wise, if you're asked the same question 4 or 5 years in a row, the best way to nip it in the bud is to deal with it at the time. And he's been asked over and over and over again about me to an embarrassing degree. I didn't want to be featured in the hustings for the elections, for example. If he'd answered it the first time, it would just have gone away a long time ago. But he doesn't seem able to answer that straight question.
Right. Do you think you have been treated with dignity and respect?
Absolutely not, no.
Why do you say that?
Because when you've got people briefing against you and then being caught briefing against you, as I have, and being sort of hauled for trial, sort of witch trial. In one instance, I was on trial for 13 months for liking tweets and things. He's never intervened, he's never supported me or spoken to me about it.
Oh, that's interesting. Has he never asked you to sit down with him and explain your views?
No, eventually, after a lot of sort of toing and froing with one of the senior whips just before the election, I think I got 17 minutes with Keir, and that's after 4 years.
Right, so you have sat down with him? You have been able to explain your views?
For about 17 minutes, and it was he looked at me like I was an alien. I don't think he has any concept why women in particular have been so vexed by this.
Okay. I want to play you another clip and then ask you if you have any concept of why some trans people in particular are so vexed by this.
Yeah.
And this clip from a trans woman shows the anxiety that some are feeling.
I wanted to leave the UK personally because I feel like I should not stay in a country where I don't feel safe. I want to be able to actually live my life free of judgment, free of having all the time the treading on shells, whether or not I am free to walk among the community around us. And I don't want to keep being in that constant turmoil.
I mean, there's a real fear, real distress.
Yeah.
Can you empathise with that?
Of course, that's an awful way to feel about your own country. If people are genuinely feeling that sad and that worried, that's awful. I wouldn't want that on anyone. I wouldn't wish that on anyone at all.
Do you think you bear any responsibility for those feelings?
I think the problem with the fact that women's rights and trans rights have clashed is because no one was really drilling down into the Equality Act. In 2010, when it came forward, this wasn't an issue, and we didn't adjust our thinking or look at it or look at amending it. And now it's as though it's the first time we've thought about this. And it's because politicians have buried their head in the sand, all of us, and we haven't dealt with the issue. But there
Politicians
shouldn't
have
be.
failed.
Yeah, absolutely. There shouldn't be a clash of rights, but unfortunately, sometimes there is.
You have tweeted or liked posts which some say are transphobic. I'll just read one to you. This was 2020. You wrote on X, "I'm a transphobe for knowing that only women have a cervix." And Jane Haybrook, who is a barrister, tweeted this. "Rosie Duffield's tweet is awful. She is erasing trans men completely. Trans men don't necessarily have their cervix removed. I'm so tired of people not affording other people the dignity they deserve as fellow human beings."
That's a really important point. And to be honest, at the time I probably didn't think about trans men in that moment. But yeah, of course I do. I know a lot more about the issue now that I've sort of been steeped in it. And at the time, Piers Morgan was making a point that if we put out this language that people need to get their cervix checked for cervix cancer, it is confusing language. I have a lot of migrants in my constituency. They're not going to understand that. If sometimes they don't speak English, their husbands go to the doctor for them. We have to be really clear that this is about women mostly. Of course it affects some people, but you're not telling me that if you've gone through the transition process, you don't still know that you've got a cervix. I mean, I think people should be credited with a bit more awareness of their own bodies than that.
For the record, are you transphobic?
Absolutely not. Of course not. That'd be like saying I don't like, people with a skin colour or trousers or something. Of course not. Absolutely not, no.
Let's talk about some of the practical issues that arise from the ruling. Are you expecting a trans man who's biologically female and looks like a man to use the women's changing rooms at the local baths, for example?
See, that's where this conversation now starts, because we haven't dealt with it. So the court has affirmed that the Equality Act made it clear, or should have made it clearer, we should have interpreted it better, that biological sex is what trumps everything else in terms of those safe spaces.
So the answer to that question is yes.
But I think providers can do better than that. I think if you're running a leisure centre, it's not beyond the wit of those people to provide safer spaces for trans people as well.
Right.
Unisex, loos, or however they go forward, they've got to consult with the trans community, not me. I don't know about those things.
Would you be one of those people advocating for those so-called third spaces?
I think if that's what the trans community want, then absolutely they should be talking to their local councils or their local theatre or museum or whoever provides those spaces. Absolutely, yeah.
Our political correspondent correspondent Helen Catt is reporting tonight that political parties are expected to be told that trans women can't be on women-only shortlists, but trans men can. Would you welcome that? Is that the logical conclusion of the Supreme Court ruling?
I mean, I think that's perfectly okay, because women want to be free from men, biological men, in our loos and our changing rooms because of the very physical difference. Men are usually bigger, stronger. They have the actual weapon that causes rape. I mean, you know, there are practical differences, and that's what we've been concerned about.
And even if it's a trans man who's a biological female but looks like a man, I mean, would you welcome them?
That's really not for me to say. I've been there advocating for women's rights.
You know how you feel.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not overly worried about trans men, to be honest. I don't feel threatened by them. I feel threatened potentially by biological men who haven't transitioned.
The Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, today asked the Prime Minister if he would be apologising to you. Would you like an apology from Sir Keir Starmer?
To be honest, I'm not bothered. Keir and I don't get on particularly well. I've never called for an apology. It would be nice to think that the things they put me through, he could just quietly say sorry, but it's about the women and men, actually, who've been drummed out of the party, stopped from being candidates. I would never get through the candidacy process now. I sneaked through a few years ago before this was an issue, but no way would I get endorsed now. And I think it's all those people who've been blocked, barred, drummed out of the party, whose name you'll never hear, and there are thousands of them, actually. They need an apology.
They need an apology from Keir Starmer?
Yes.
You obviously sit as an independent MP. You left Labour in part, you say, by the way you were treated by some in your party.
Yeah.
Is there a way back for you to the Labour Party?
I'd really like to think so, but, you know, if they're going to gaslight me and pretend that they always thought this and that they weren't mean to me really, and all that sort of stuff, I wrote before that it felt like an abusive relationship at times. That's very much a strand of an abusive relationship.
And do you still feel like
everything?
that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's no acknowledgement that, they now agree with me.
Right.
You know, there's no acknowledgement of that. And that actually,
but isn't,
maybe I was
we
right.
welcome the Supreme Court ruling, we accept it. Isn't that an acknowledgement of that?
No, because they actively briefed against me, stopped me, told my CLP things about me that then got into the public domain about my personal life and things like that. So no, not yet. I need to know that I'm safe in the party again.
Thank you very much, Rosie Duffied, for talking to us on Newsnight.